what I've depicted here is something that I'm sure that you have experienced, if not in your current situation, certainly in your career, or you've seen it on the outside, and that is that in the face of growth and scale and complexity, particularly with the aggressive growth targets that we saw through the 90s and into the 2000s, when one couples that those factors with a linear and siloed approach to risk thinking, typically what we find is negative surprises or unanticipated consequences. You think about this in the context of mergers and acquisitions, for example, growing through an acquisition but perhaps not really giving complete thought to all of the risk inherent in an integration process. It's one of the reasons why, I don't know what the statistic is now, but there used to be I remember 86 to 90% of mergers and acquisitions failed to live up to the espoused business value targets. A lot of that was simply because the organizations didn't anticipate the risks inherent in the integration process with systems integrations and things like that. In terms of scale, for example, you look at BP, you look at the Deepwater Horizon disaster. BP was in a situation where, you talk about scale as this until I went back and looked at it, they were drilling not only to the bottom of the ocean, but they were drilling 3 miles below the ocean floor in that situation with that rig. That scale and complexity on a scale that no driller had ever experienced before. BP is actually a great study in itself. But so you see this pattern played out time and time again, and ERM seeks to get in the middle of that and ensure that those negative surprises and unanticipated consequences do not occur. I love this quote at the bottom from a good article by Michael Power. It says, ideally, ERM can be a rational response to an increasingly risky world. I think another important aspect of this is acknowledging the boundaries and the limitations of risk management in general. This is kind of a back to basics, but as you set out on an ERM program or you're in the middle of it, taking stock of where you are, I think it's helpful to remember where the risk management value proposition starts and where it ends. And this comes not from my own thinking, but from a great article by Dr. Renee Stoltz at Ohio State. And what he said, and I agree with, and I'm paraphrasing a little bit, but risk management can do a few things. It can assess the risks faced by a firm. It can communicate them to those who are making those decisions. It can also manage and monitor the risks to make sure that management and the board are operating within their risk appetite. Risk management really cannot directly or shouldn't set core business strategy. The setting of core business strategy, according to Dr. Stoltz, and again I agree, is really a function of risk appetite, which is the responsibility of the board and senior management, not necessarily risk management. I don't believe that it's proper or appropriate for the risk management function to execute core business strategy, nor third, should it have primary responsibility for risk-taking decisions. Now, clearly, risk management should have input in terms of things like risk retention decisions and those kinds of things. But in terms of the actual core business and strategic decisions, putting the capital of a firm at risk in terms of how it's going to grow, et cetera, risk management can have input into that process, but frankly, risk management shouldn't get tagged with the ultimate responsibility for that if something goes wrong. There's been a lot of talk about that recently in financial institutions in terms of some of the failures in the firms that did not do well in the recent downturn, in the recent credit crisis, liquidity crunch. Some of those were risk management failures. Frankly, some of them were not. And as a capstone point, just finally on this on this topic, suggests it's important to understand it's not an inoculation. ERM is not an inoculation against losses. It's not an immunity to losses. And I love this quote. In summary, risk management really doesn't prevent losses. You can have good risk management in place, and large losses can still occur when those making those risk-taking decisions conclude that taking those risks, if they're well understood, creates value for their organizations. And so, certainly over time you can look at really, really good risk managing organizations or organizations that had good risk management where management decides to take a decision and quite frankly it just doesn't work out. Doesn't mean it was a risk management failure. It just simply means that it didn't work out.
Rick, I think to summarize a couple points you very well made, one of the best executives I've ever dealt with is J.F. Hines, who is Associate CFO at Microsoft. And he said it very clearly. He said, risk management is never going to run this company, meaning exactly what you were expressing, that there's input from risk management, but ultimately the decision makers have to take those into account and appropriately make their decisions. So maybe that's a bit of a lead into this next question we've raised, is what is the practical objective of an ERM program?
Sure. I think one of the reasons that some ERM programs, frankly, detour, Rick, is that we jump into the what and the how before we deal with the why. And so in answering the question, what's the objective of an ERM program, I think there is some real sort of thoughtful discovery and discussion that needs to take place. And I think that starts with understanding your organization's unique mandate. And I use the word unique there because, again, I do think it's a one-size-fits-one. Consider those factors that are driving you and start talking about what those things are. Because there really does, I mean, with any change program, any change initiative, there needs to be a burning platform, as we know. There needs to be a compelling reason to do something, because this involves change. Sometimes this involves thinking in different ways. And what I've thrown on the slide 12 here is just simply, I'm not going to go through them detail one by one, but what I'm sharing here is just some of the aspects of mandates that I've experienced over the past. The first bullet, one of the most recent examples, was an organization that just simply would get to the end of the quarter, publicly held reporting institution, and they would get to the end of the quarter, 30 days from the end of the quarter, and something would happen. There'd be some systems failure, there would be some data breach, there would be something that would happen that would cost ½ cent per share, and they would have to explain it. And quite frankly, it left them shaking their heads. And after it happened frequently, over a period of time, they said, we've got to get our arms around this, and we've got to understand why this is happening, get on the front end of these errors and these mistakes. And they chose, an ERM approach, particularly focused on their operations, to deal with that issue. Again, client demands for greater risk management capability, things like increasing regulatory scrutiny, that might be part of your mandate if you're a very heavily regulated organization. The fact of the matter is, if you're heavily regulated, you're already doing ERM. But the last point I wanted to make, and this kind of gets back to Rick's point from the very beginning, of understanding the essence of your organization and what that is. If you do nothing more than focus on the short list of what I would call value killer risk. That's actually a Deloitte coined term, but I like it. In other words, those things that can really kill your market cap quickly, those risk issues that are always on your top risk dashboard. If you do nothing more than just sort of cloud up and rain on those risks, that short list, then you're certainly going to be making progress in this area. And so that's just part of the mandate, but I think it's a very, very important first step in getting to your ERM objective. Secondly, rather than, again, jumping right into process, figure out what you want to get from this. What are you going to enjoy at the end of all of this striving called enterprise risk management? Figure out what your business results are going to be, and then design and implement the activity to get to those ends. It could be things like reducing earnings volatility. Again, what we just said, reducing the number and the frequency and the magnitude of operational surprises. Again, I won't go through the details here. Maybe these are familiar to you. Maybe you've already approached it in this way. But after your mandate, I think it's important to understand what are the business results that we're seeking from ERM. And then thirdly, before you even get to tactical objectives for what we're going to do with ERM, I think it's important as a third step to really figure out what are your guiding principles. If you've thought enough about this, this is something that will come out of that. It's just sort of fundamental basic statements that speak clearly to what ERM is and what it is not. At Invesco, for example, I'm just sharing you exactly what our guiding principles are on this slide. We decided that it was a process built into the business, that it was not going to be a separate centralized function. But we wanted to build a risk management into the DNA of the organization. Skipping down to the fourth bullet, this was a refrain of ours at Invesco. The value is in the dialogue. Everything that we did around enterprise risk management was directed toward making sure that the tough risk-reward conversations were taking place. And that, again, Rick mentioned in the beginning of the program today, the ERM is fundamentally about facilitating. It's more of a coaching function than an actual execution function, I would submit. And it's facilitating risk information flow and insight. The last bullet on that slide, we shouldn't become overly enamored with our process and reports. That's one of the detours that I'll mention in a moment. But in terms of getting to objectives, I think those three things are very important. Understand your mandate, understand the desired results from a business standpoint, and really be able to articulate clearly what the guiding principles of ERM is and what it is not.
Thank you, Rick. In truth, we're trying to package something which could take days into this hour, and one of the things Rick has provided is some references, and we will also make these slides and even a rebroadcast of the program should you need a little more time. Rick, we've talked about Detours, and let me just ask you to summarize some of those that you've experienced in your efforts to implement ERM programs.
Sure, thanks, Rick. So there are many, many possible detours that exist, but I've chosen to focus on two principally here, because from my experience, these tend to be both very frequent detours that I see and very pervasive detours of ERM programs. One is preoccupation with process. The second is, and I put it in quotes because it's not my original term, but the notion of delusional optimism. And I'm just going to take those one at a time. Getting first into a preoccupation with process is the first detour. I think that this can assume a couple of different manifestations. One is that we get so enamored with our process, with the activity, with the risk assessments and the heat maps and the system that we're using and the process of all of it, that we just, quite frankly, start to miss the big picture. You sort of miss the forest for the trees, so to speak. I'll talk about an example here in a moment where I think that was evident at UBS. Very, very poignant example. But some have referred to ERM when it's not done well as sort of a navel-gazing, kind of thing, where you just get so inwardly focused that you begin to lose the capability to kind of see and manage the big picture. Second thing I think is confusing the ends with the means in ERM process. We get so enamored with the activity and the things that we're doing on a day-to-day basis. In other words, the means that we really start believing that process is inherently valued and inherently valuable. And what I found as both an internal practitioner of ERM and as a consultant is that boards and senior management are not, they don't place inherent value on process. What they're concerned about is, what is this process delivering? What is the fruit that's being born from this process? Are we making better decisions? Are we lowering our cost of capital? Again, back to your mandate and your desired business results. And so it's another one of the reasons why it's important to do that thinking up front, because when you get to the point, if you do get to a stall point where you do start navel-gazing and getting preoccupied with process, you've got to have something to go back to say, why are we doing this in the first place? What did we say this was going to accomplish? And so we have to be careful not to confuse the ends with the means.